Good morning, welcome to my next video, and I'm going to look at the group of Opisthobrachia, which I believe today is more appropriate to call this group the Heterobrachia. They've gone through a lot of taxonomy regroupings in recent years. In fact, over the last 20 years, to my knowledge, there's been 4 major regroupings of this superfamily or class. So I think all the shells in here are also known by that second name, Cephalaspidia, and then the bubble shells, I think they all fit under the category of Actionoidea. Although again, it sort of depends upon which taxonomy you're looking at. So there's an overview of the shells, mainly looking at bubble shells, but I've also included some sea hare shells and some umbrella shells. So let's now start looking at some specific specimens. So here is some well-known and beautiful bubble shells. We've got physis there, very widely spread throughout Australian waters, the Indo-Pacific, and perhaps further afield. Beautiful lineata. The animal of that shell is absolutely superb. Its iridescence, its fluorescence. I love observing them in rock pools. And needless to say, all of those shells were dead collected. Albus cincta, there, quite a few Albus cincters. I'll have another look at a few. There's my group down there, and there's my largest one at 5.6 centimeters, and next to it is my largest physis shell at 5.1 centimeters. All right, here we have some Amplustra shells and related, 2 very different, so I suspect 2 very different species there. They're perhaps the most sought after bubble shell is that of Aloisae. It certainly commands high prices and probably the most expensive of the bubble shells that I'm aware of. Phlemeus, Virgatus, that black and white sort of line zigzags there. Just looking at these very quickly, naming a few of them. Soligula, Sulcatus, lovely shell there that comes from southern Queensland. There is a scaphander. That one's from Brazil. There's a small one there. I've collected locally. I've got no idea what species that is. And that's very often the case when you find very small bubble shells. The most well-known scaphander would be this one here, Lignaria or Lignarius from Europe. A couple more there. And my largest specimen there is 5.5 centimeters. So some other glorious bubble shells. Just look at them. Details on some of those shells. Beautiful. That's a well-known species from striata. You get that from many locations across Europe, etc. Right, look at a couple of local shells now. We've got here Saluta, very interesting, unusual shell. Next to that, we've got Norcum, which I've got from many different locations throughout the Indo-Pacific. The little groupings here are shells like Koi, Ampulla, Angusi. I'm sure there's some others. Interesting when you look at the Ampulla, extremely variable. So I wouldn't be surprised if there are a number of species there. And there's my largest Ampulla at 6.4 So I'm just looking at my notes, 6.3 centimetres. And that one's from Western Australia. Beautiful colours and pattern on that. So sonata, I should say. Beautiful, beautiful shell. Another sonata, quite different colouring, very fragile shell. Talking of fragile shells and local shells, there's one there, extremely fragile. I've collected, I'd say 3 or 4 times that many shells. Most of them end up broken by the time I get home. In fact, even picking them up, they can often break in your fingers. And then another very fragile local shell is over here. The same story, very fragile. So a lot of the bubble shells are indeed very fragile. Others are much more robust, but certainly light. Although interestingly, that very large ampulla is surprisingly heavy. I guess the fact that it's so large and it's had time for the shell to thicken over its lifetime. All right, and then a number of, just quickly look at, and here's another well-known local shell there, which I find many specimens of. Almost every time I go collecting, I'll find a couple of those. And then here's some interesting ones. These are certainly from overseas. I'll look at the labels here. So there's one from Canary Islands. Mobili, beautiful shell that. Beautiful markings. And then next to it is another one. This one's from Mozambique. Comparing with Cruentata. Again, another beautiful shell. All right, so that's cylindrica. How could I not mention that? There's so many different types of cylindrica. I've found that in, I think, every state and territory in Australia, and depending upon the locality, very different in size. That's quite large shells there, and then in other places they can be much, much smaller. So interesting ones here, interesting shapes with that. Obviously not cylindrica, different species, but again, the literature on a lot of these shells is not widely available, so I have had trouble identifying quite a few of them. All right, I think that's the main ones I wanted to look at. Oh, just a nice little very fragile one there from New Zealand, Zealandier. Okay, very fragile, and I have had more specimens than that over the years, but they broken. All right, now let's have a look at the sea hares, and I'll let this particular label talk for itself. I'll let you read that. So that would imply that this shell really can only be found if you find the dead animal and extract the shell, because it is so light. I've got no weight on that whatsoever. If I was to put it between my fingers and close them, the whole shell would crush. And I suspect if that shell was still in the decaying animal, that the shell itself would just disintegrate. So I think you'd be very unlikely to find that washed up on a beach. I think the only way you could collect that would be to find the dead animal and extract it. Here, though, a different story. These obviously last the decaying of the animal. Obviously a much more robust, solid shell. So there's Western Australia, there's the name there for that particular sea hare. And in fact, I found those 3 specimens in Fiji, and very interesting shells. I wasn't really aware of what they were when I first found them, so it's nice to be able to solve that mystery. All right, and I always, of course, when I finish these videos, think, oh, I should have spoken about that shell. Anyway, at least you can see all the species I've got there. And then the last little group I want to look at are the umbrella shells. I think I've got them in the right grouping when I put them in Opisthobrachia. Not sure if they're included in the Heterobrachia group, but anyway, I've included them here. I had them incorrectly placed amongst the false limpets for many years. There is a well-known Australian species. I think that's very common, certainly through the Indo-Pacific, and in fact even further spread than that. I think that's the most common of all of these umbrella shells. Umbraculum. And then there's other species as well, like this one here from Brazil, and it's called plicatum. Lots of, I'm not exactly sure how many species there are of this shell. The literature suggests that anything from 5 to 14 to 20 plus, depending upon which article you looked at. Anyway, there's just, and such a large animal. I guess the story I've got connected to these shells is once in Sydney at Gibbon Beach many years ago, I came across literally hundreds of these animals. And for instance, the largest shell there is just over 7 centimeters. The animal that would go with that shell would be in excess of 20 centimeters. And quite a shock to find them at low tide, just sitting on the mud and sand flats. I assumed it must have been around breeding time. And very interesting. I should also point out as well, all of those shells are dead collected. So, all right, thank you very much for watching my video, and I hope that was interesting. Thank you.